Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Greetings. Welcome to Swayam Prabha DTH 16 channel. My name is Ariba Shabbir and we have been discussing English language teaching. Today we are going to start a new module, and this module is assessment. So in this session we will study assessment in second language learning. So before we go ahead, let us recapitulate of what we did in the last session. In the last session, we discussed that it is important to learn and prepare needs analysis before preparing for material production. We also understood that it is important to consider guidelines that are required for designing effective English teaching materials. Besides, we looked on how to adapt material, and we studied that it is important to evaluate the material that we prescribe to students. For example, evaluating a textbook on the basis of certain parameters such as authenticity, comprehensibility, and the length of the content. Besides, we studied that how authentic materials should be given a special focus, and if proper guidelines are followed while producing materials, the course is likely to give effective outcomes. The materials should reflect a situation that learners may face in an English speaking environment, and this will eventually help them transition into a world where English is the form. So dear learners, as you know that today we are going to talk on assessment. So let us quickly see the slide and try to analyze that the outcomes of the learning would be to develop the general understanding of assessment, types of assessment, and characteristics. Besides, we will get to know the difference between assessment and evaluation. In addition, we will be able to identify the main purposes of assessment in the language classroom. And after this session, you will be able to identify the essential qualities of good assessments. Besides, you will also be able to identify methods for reporting on performance, and then we will summarize characteristics of assessment tasks. Now let us look at this slide and understand the concept of assessment. So the first definition, as you see in the slide mentioned by Jones, it is assessment that is a classroom activity, and it is basically a fundamental process which is always required in a classroom and in order to achieve learning and ultimately achievement. So after the learning, what we exactly do is that we assess students, and assessment is not just an important part, but it is an essential part of any language learning pedagogy. So it is an inclusive activity of language classroom, and it is a fundamental concept that is included in any kind of situation. We also see that assessment involves the use of empirical data on student learning to refine programs and improve student learning. So by empirical data, the writer means that we collect the details in the form of marks, and at some time we address the qualitative information of the students as well. So we ultimately go for collecting some kind of data which helps us in analyzing the effectiveness of our course and also the progress and the growth of our students. Another definition which is given by Huber and Fried, they say that assessment is the process of gathering and discussing information from multiple and diverse sources in order to develop a deep understanding of what students know, understand and can do with their knowledge as a result of their educational experiences. The process culminates when assessment results are used to improve subsequent learning. So not just that we collect data and we identify the students' growth and potentials, it is also important to understand that we gather a deep understanding of what students already have in their bags. By bags, I mean what background knowledge do they consider, and of course what kind of level they have with regard to their understanding of the language, and what kind of competency do they possess, so that the materials or the methodology which is going to be adapted in the language classroom would be fruitful enough for them. So as you see that we have gone through the 3 definitions of assessment. Each definition opens up the concept of assessment in a new perspective, and each definition tells us that we collect data, we promote learning, we look for achievement, we analyze the students' learning, and we ultimately goal for having students developing their extensive growth. Now going on to the next slide, it is important to differentiate the 2 important concepts here, assessment and evaluation, because often we see that many of the learners and teachers get confused of these 2 terms. So let us try to make a sharp differentiation here. Assessment, as you read in the first slide, it aims to enable learners to adjust their approach or study habits so that they can enhance their learning. By getting the overview of their performance, they eventually find themselves in a position to change themselves, to change their habits, or even teachers change their approach in order to promote growth, development and enhance the knowledge that they are providing it to the learners. Now on contrary, we see that evaluation is basically a process that uses a variety of quantitative and qualitative techniques to analyze the program, and this is related to pedagogical or course outcomes which are relevant to determine whether they have been met. So we collect the data, we analyze it through quantitative and qualitative analysis, and then we look for its validity with regard to the pedagogical implementation. That's what evaluation stands for. However, assessment gives a broader view, and it tells us that what to adopt, what not to adopt, and how to take the class throughout the course. The essential point which is mentioned in this slide says that assessment is a diagnostic tool which is mainly focused on the learning of individual students, whereas evaluation actually determines the extent, it takes us to the depth to which a program or pedagogy achieves or predetermined goals or outcomes. So as you have got a sharp understanding of 2 important concepts, assessment, evaluation, and we have also got to know that though both the tools are interrelated, but they are quite different when it comes to implementation. Now why do we include assessment? What is its purpose? And in order to search the answer of these questions, let us first look up at the purpose of assessment. Why, what would do we aim for? What vision do we have when it comes to implementing assessment into our classrooms? So at first we think of checking the students' progress, how far they have learned, and it should give teachers feedback on their students' performance at different stages of the course. So it is pretty clear over here that teachers, in order to get the feedback and in order to assess the students' performances, they conduct assessment. And it is mandatory and it is an inclusive part of any classroom pedagogy. But when it comes to initial or diagnostic assessment, we will get to know the concept of the diagnostic assessment in the other slides as well. But here let us try to understand the point that diagnostic assessments, which are often conducted at the initial time of language learning, so these kind of assessments help teachers, educators, policy makers, especially syllabus designers, material producers, to identify the students' strengths and weaknesses, and on the basis of that the learners get the required material. So what I am trying to tell you here is that learners not just get the material what they required, but teachers also find a reason, and also they get to know about their strengths and weaknesses, and then they include skills accordingly. The other point which is mentioned over here is that we have formative assessment, which is done throughout the course in order to check the students' progress. These are the kind of assessments which are eventually done during the course process. And then by the end of the semester or the course, we conduct summative assessment, which is designed to find out what students can do and what students cannot do at the end of the course. So it basically brings the crux of the course and the crux of the learning, and it is very essential. However, both formative keeps the progress, summative brings the last result. There is a difference that we will go through in the other slide, but let us try to view these concepts in a broader horizon and understand the point that reinforcing the students' learning is important, and that is the ultimate reason why we conduct assessment. It is a way of giving students regular feedback so that they are aware of their growth. In addition, it gives teachers basic information about how successful the teaching is, so that they can see whether the approach is correct, the aims of the course are appropriate, and the materials which we often talk about are efficient or are efficient enough or are good enough to help the learners grow in a better way. So these are the purposes of assessment, and because it provides a whole view of the students' learning progress, their personality, their growth, their development and their progress. So the purpose is pretty clear, and it gives a broader perspective, a broader view on how to look up at the classroom, how to proceed further, and what do you expect at the end of the course. Now moving on to the next slide, let us look up at the three important concepts which are known as the types of assessment. Though we have used these terms in the previous slide also, but in order to give you a deeper understanding, let us take these topics in detail. So as you see, the first one is the initial or diagnostic. Why initial? Because diagnostics test is often conducted at the beginning of the course. Assessment is done at the beginning of the course, and it basically aims to identify the students' particular strengths and weaknesses. So it's basically a pre-assessment or a pre-test where teachers can evaluate students' strengths, weaknesses, knowledge and skills before the instruction. And these assessments are typically low stakes and usually don't count for grades. An identical assessment may be given post instruction to identify if students have met a course required learning objectives. But with this form of assessment, teachers can plan, and they can plan meaningful and efficient instruction and can provide students with an individualized learning experience. So a meaningful way is basically created with the help of diagnostic assessment and written by students. The diagnostic assessment is a tool for teachers to better understand what students already know about a topic when submitted before the start of the course. And diagnostic assessments, let me tell you, are used to gauge where students currently stand, that is intellectually, emotionally and ideologically. Now coming on to the second term which is written over here, and that is formative assessment. So what do we think of formative assessment? Formative assessment is done throughout the course in order to check the students' progress. Though formative and summative assessments are interrelated, but there is a huge difference between the two concepts. Let me take up this as well. Summative assessment is designed to find out what students can and cannot do at the end of the course, like we talked in the last slide as well. So what I'm trying to mention you here is that formative and summative assessments are widely practiced components of classroom setting that report ongoing and final progress of the learner. So despite of challenges in integrating formative assessment and summative assessments into English language instruction, its implementation has been supported in accordance with the students' needs. So let us not forget the fact that summative assessment is conducted annually, or it is conducted at the conclusion of the program. How well students are equipped with the skills, knowledge and have made achievement when it comes to the progress and checking out the progress annually. So students are asked to write assignments, tests or projects to determine whether they have learned of what they were expecting or not. And the achievement test is also conducted at the conclusion of the session, where learners are given the specific instructional period to attempt certain questions. And the test does not assess the strength or weaknesses of the learner, but it actually determines the overall experience of the learner and the learning that took place in the whole session. The results are either presented in scores or grades, which are further reported into students' record. So like you have studied these three important concepts: diagnostic, formative, summative, and I'm sure you have now got a pretty clear idea that how these three are distinct with each other, and they have a different purpose to serve when it comes to language learning and teaching pedagogy. So it's quite clear that we would need all these kind of assessments in order to make students learn and develop language, and also in order to help our teachers to implement the course and design the materials in an efficient way. Now moving on to the next slide, let us try to understand that why do we assess? I mean, we have got this fact that assessment is important. It's an inclusive part of the language learning pedagogy. We looked for the purposes of assessment, but what are the essential components that we take into consideration? What assessment criteria are there on the basis of which we look for certain parameters? So I put this into this slide and let us go one by one. At first, there is linguistic skills. So when I talk about linguistic skills, it means there are set parameters that you look for when it comes to assessing the students' learning with regard to language learning. So first is pronunciation. So you see that many students have difficulty in pronouncing sir sound and sh sound. Similarly, dark la and light la, and then plenty of sounds they find difficult to understand, and many times we see that because of the interference of the mother tongue, there is a difficulty in pronouncing the right and accurate sounds. So you mainly look for the English sounds if they are produced correctly, and that's why the pronunciation comes into account in order to sound intelligible you need to look for pronunciation, and that's quite essential for any language learning. Therefore, pronunciation plays an important role, and it is generally assessed when it comes to language learning and teaching. Since language is inclusive of vocabulary, so we cannot forget the important role that is played by it. So it is not just that we learn the vocabulary or we know the number of words that are there in the dictionary. Rather, vocabulary is more for what kind of word is suited when it comes to context. So there should be a match between the content and the context. So the vocabulary plays an important role when it comes to assessing language learning. And then we see grammar, which is again an essential part. Why grammar? Because grammar and the sense of grammaticality that is developed in second language learners or foreign language learners, they makes them intelligible, and therefore a correct or accurate grammatical sentence gives the better results. Therefore, it's not just that only grammatical sentence is put in a right way, but also meaningfully it is creating an impact. So grammar is important, and linguistically it should be accurate. Besides, let us not forget the role of spellings. Sometimes we see that in English language, spelling keeps on mattering, and spellings differ from one to the other. It doesn't follow as such the norm. So spelling is very important when it comes to assessing. And then role of discourse. So when a writer produces a write-up, is there any coherence in the text? Right. The other thing is there any cohesion in the text? By cohesion I mean, are there devices, cohesive devices that are used? So these coherence and cohesion as a part of discourse play an important role when it comes to assessing. So when we look at text or when we hear a second language learner, it is not merely that one component we assess, but we mainly look the whole scenario, and this whole scenario consists of pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, spelling, and the rule of discourse, which are constituting towards a particular outcome. And we are not consigned to only linguistic skills. Let me tell you that there are communicative skills. If you remember, in the methods we talked about accuracy versus appropriacy. So it is not just the grammatical structure that matters, but the meaning also is there, which matters a lot. So we talked about communicative competence as well. And we mentioned that communicative competence helps a learner to analyze the text or the word in a social context. So communicative competence focus more on social clues, right? So we assess communicative skills in addition to linguistic skills, and communicative skills will fall under the 4 categories that are also known as the 4 skills of language. These are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The efficiency of performance includes fluency, appropriacy, coherence, and a wide choice of structures and lexes that are available in the text. So by fluency is the facility of a task performance if the learner is able to complete it with the right speed. The appropriacy is the suitability of the content that is put up in the context. Then one sentence is connected with the other, which is ultimately the reflection of coherence. that is the logical development of the content, and then a wide variety of structures, and there is a variation which exists. One sentence is simple, the other one could be compound, and you could find complex sentences. So not just one kind of sentence that you see that the learners are able to produce a wide variety of sentences in the particular context or situation. So these are the components that we look for, and we assess on the text on the basis of these kind of factors that are responsible for making the content enriching. Now going on to the next slide, let us answer this question that when do we assess? What is the right time to assess? Is it that in between the course we can assess, or at the end of the course we assess, or is it something like we do it at the beginning? So what are the right timings when it comes to assessing the language ability? So let's see these points. As mentioned by the researchers, we often do assessments at the beginning of the course, which means we may do it as initial assessment or diagnostic assessment to help learners and teachers identify their strengths and weaknesses. Now at the end of the course, we either do the summative, which means that whether we have achieved the goal or not, and we also call achievement test, which is quite important when it comes to the completion of course, that how much achievement you have taken or how much gains you have collected from the course. So both the ways are possible, and when it is done throughout the course, not only at the end of these specific periods, they are formally regarded as formative assessments. Moreover, we also do continuous assessments. Now coming up to the concept of continuous assessments, which may include informal activities done in the ordinary lesson and not only under formal exam conditions. So it usually happens that when the teacher wants to know if a particular or a short-term goal is achieved or not, then what happens is that the continuous assessment is often regulated, and this helps the teacher and the learner to know the progress at that particular point of time. So it is quite time bounded, and it helps us to know whether we are constituting towards ourselves towards the short goals, and then when the short term goals are covered, this will ultimately lead to the long term goals. So we will go step by step. It's not that the holistic way, in a way that we will lead to, we will move towards the long term goals. We will go from simple to complex, or we can divide our course components into fragments and chunks. So continuous assessment is quite helpful, and we can do it in the form of group discussions. We can eventually take surprise tests, and we can give them activities and tasks so that we would come to know the application part of our methodology. So all these periods, be it the beginning or at the end or throughout or at the in an informal way, all the ways are possible. So dear learners, now let us try to look up at the characteristics that are involved in assessment. So there are 5 points that are mentioned here, and let's go one by one. At first, validity is there. So an assessment task is considered valid if it reflects the knowledge and skill you intend to check, if it measures what it claims to be measuring. So if you are including listening assessment, you should include a variety of listening tasks as well. It's not just that you include only one kind of listening test, which may not give you a clear idea of your students learning in a deeper way. So you should include a variety of it. Variations would always be helpful. So let's consider the fact that listening can be categorized into listening for specific information and listening for gist. And when it comes to listening for specific information, you can ask students to identify or to listen for one or two particular details that were announced, right? And in listening for gist, you can make them listen the whole story or the announcement or the TED talk, and then you can ask, what do you think this talk is about, and what opinions do you form? So on the basis of the knowledge that they will form, they will eventually be able to put up their points of views. So what I'm trying to mention you is that knowledge and skill you intend to check should be included. It should measure what it aims to be. It should not be devoid or deprived of the objective that you had taken at the beginning of the course. So validity is an important component of any assessment. A valid assessment is always a helpful tool for any language teacher and learner, and a valid assessment will give you a deeper reflection of your learners' progress and the development. Now coming on to the second point. So now let's take up another important concept over here, that is transparency. A transparent assessment is always an ideal one, and the marking system should be clear, and the learner should know the system as well as the minimum score to pass. This will guide the learners to do the test in a better way. And you know, when you give them the sense of accountability and you empower them with the parameters that they are going to be analyzed, they are going to be judged, they will find themselves in a position to get command over those things. So it is important to help learners get aware on the parameters that they are going to be judged on, and they should be clear enough about the system that is going to be followed. So for example, they are listening, speaking and reading and writing skills. You should tell the learners that listening is going to be comprised of 20 marks and the speaking would comprised of, let's say, 30 marks. The rest of the components would include the rest of the marks. You know, in this way you will tell them the weightage, and then you can tell them that when it comes to speaking ability, you will be judged on the basis of clarity, on the basis of the content development, your pronunciation would matter and your confidence would matter. So in this way learners will build these parameters in themselves, and they will come prepared and they will know what they have to perform, and therefore this will make the test transparent, and they will be empowered with the kind of accountability that they always seek for. Now, after knowing validity and transparency, let us look up at the concept of feasibility. So teachers should consider ease of setting, time involved, administering and scoring. It's important to think of the time constraints that your learners are going to face. So what generally happens is that you design a long test, and as a result the time which is given to the learners is not enough. Therefore you should think that before you make the test and you aim for assessing it, think of the parameters, like what time frame is being given to the learners. Is it going to be for 2 hours or is it going to be 1 hour? And even in continuous assessment or in formative assessments, if it is going to be for, let's say, 30 minutes or maybe 45 minutes, so is your test justifying the time frame that is given to the learners? So time is quite essential in order to make the learning and the assessment feasible. Also, teachers should consider the setting. Are they going to be sitting in a comfortable place? Also, if the computer equipment is going to be included, then are these equipments working properly? What about the internet connection? And who will administer this test? How many invigilators would be there? What would be the criteria, and what would be the rubrics or the scoring system that would be involved when it comes to assessing it? So you have to think of the feasibility of the test, and eventually identify its shortcomings as well, so that you make a proper setting and you deliver the test in a most successful way. Now coming on to the next point, it is mentioned over here reliability, how far the test becomes reliable. The assessment gives the reflection of being reliable. This has to do with the consistency of the results of your assessment. So a reliable assessment task is one that produces essentially the same results consistently on different occasions when the conditions of the assessment remain the same. So for instance, let's say that your learner has gained 15 marks in listening out of 30. And in reading also, the learner has got somehow 18 or 19 marks out of 30. Now what happens is that if your learner gains 28 out of 30 in speaking, it may reflect the point that a test might not be reliable enough. Why? Because these 4 skills are not going in line. You know, a good and a reliable test has to show the consistency of the learners. So it actually produces the same results. So if a learner has got, let's say 15 and then 20 or maybe 18 or maybe let's say 23, 24, it should be somehow around the circle. It cannot go too far. So that's what reliability takes us to the fact, and therefore a reliable test helps you to make the assessment clear and essential to use. So now let us look up at the last point which is mentioned in this slide. It is discrimination. By discrimination, I don't mean to discriminate the students on the basis of their social, political or economic factors. What I am trying to make a pitch over here is that your assessment should be enough to distinguish between the students who are good, average and weak. So by good I mean competent, by average I mean modest, and by weak performers I would mean novice learners. So novice are those who have just started their journey towards learning process, or they are at the initial stages of learning. So when it comes to competent learners, modest learners and novice learners, you will be ultimately helpful to get the idea of how your class is going to look like, how far this heterogeneity is comprised of, and also you will be able to find ease in grouping the students, because you cannot group all the novice students at a time, right? And also you cannot group 4 competent students in one place. So you have to somehow bring the mix of the learners. And when I say mix, by this concept I mean that, let's say if you are making the group of 6 students, you should think of including 2 competent, right, 2 modest and at least 2 novice learners, so that each student would learn from one another. And if you include all novice learners in one group, like 6 out of 6, then what will happen? They would not be able to learn from each other. They would remain at the same place. So assessment not only gives you what kind of method should you adopt and how should you take the proceedings, rather it helps the learners in a broad way, because you get know a lot about their competency, and therefore you find ease in experimenting your methods, your activities, and ultimately your assessment brings learning, which is the ultimate goal of the language learning pedagogy. Now in this slide, let us look how to plan for learning. Like you have conducted the assessment, now how can you facilitate the knowledge and the skills that you are going to provide in the field? So planning and implementation both are important, but at the same time they are different also. it would require different skills to go through it. Let's see how to plan first for learning. So decide what is going to be learned in a particular session and define the learning goals, communicate the learning goals to the learners. So at the beginning of the session, try to give the frame of what they are going to learn, mention the syllabus, give them the outcomes. Tell them that what objectives do you have when it comes to the implementation of this course, and also try to make them convinced that the methodology, the approaches that the teacher and the learner is going to have in the classroom, the kind of rapport they are going to build throughout, it would ultimately help them to bring more learning into the language learning classroom. So therefore, what I'm trying to mention over here is that giving an introductory session or orientation session would eventually give a warm-up kind of sense to them, and this warm-up activity would eventually help the teacher and the learner to find ease among themselves, and also the ice would be broken up. This ice breaking session, like I always say, it's very important, and at the same point of time you help the learner to get through the objectives, know the learning outcomes, and analyze the subject contents so that they can give their point of views and eventually know what they seek for after this class. Now the next point, as it is mentioned over here, you should compile questions and design tasks to check learner understanding of the learning questions. It's not like that once you have got the syllabus, you have got the topics, and you just start the session and you go through it. It cannot be like that. Always include activities and tasks and tests which are quite formal as well as informal. Include all those kind of factors that would ultimately make your learning and teaching exciting. So this kind of excitement will ultimately help the learners to achieve the task, and as a result the designing of those tasks and activities will promote better development of the methods. And keep on checking the learner's understanding by adopting various assessments. If you have conducted diagnostic assessment, that's pretty good, but by the end of the course, do the achievement test as well. And if you want to make your learners more amazed, then give them the difference between the diagnostic and the achievement test. Make them aware that where were they standing and now at what point are they standing. So this will make them amazed, and at the same time they will find it more acknowledging, and they will give the credit to the teacher, and the purpose of the course will be solved. Now coming on to the next point, as mentioned here, explain to the learners the criteria which will be used to assess their work, decide how feedback is going to be provided. It's not just that the teacher who's responsible to assign tasks and prescribe the materials, but you should also incorporate the learner's feedback, and the learner's feedback will give you the glimpse of what is correct, what is appropriate, what is more exciting to them. And always think of those matters, those contents that make them excited, and those are essential as well as relevant. So suppose if learners say that they like group discussion activities in their classroom, or if they prefer to use PowerPoint presentations in their classroom, so incorporate those techniques and tools more in the future, and such kind of feedback will not negatively give you any criticism, but it will ultimately promote the development of the teacher. Now coming on to the next point, define how learners will take an active part in the assessment process. So learners will not become passive here. They will not sit at one place and they will not go through what they are prescribed for, but they will take part actively. They will participate in the discussion, and they will be the persons who will be responsible in making their course successful. So things will go on both the sides, and when the learners are active enough in contributing towards their development, they should give their opinions, views in planning and implementing of the course as well. So it is quite important as well as exciting to incorporate the learners' feedback and make them active throughout the course as well as in the planning part as well. Now coming on to the last point, plan opportunities for learners to use the feedback provided on the assessment decision to make the progress ahead. Now why I say that feedback gives the learners the opportunity to work on the assessment as well as the learning, because these opportunities are beneficial for policymakers, for material designers, for educators, for students themselves, for the parents and the administrators. So by making the learners active in the process, you will be able to work on each component of the language pedagogy, be it inside the classroom or the factors and the people that are responsible outside the classroom. Now coming on to the next slide, how to communicate the assessment criteria. You can tell that these number of marks will be credited to this particular skill, but how to communicate, there's a proper criteria to do that. And while looking up in this slide, let us quickly see that you should use appropriate language and terminology. Remember, assessment is not to discourage them or not to judge them in a negative way. It is ultimately made for their upliftment, their development. Therefore you should be very cautious when it comes to the use of vocabulary and the terminology that you say when it comes to judging. Like instead of saying the weak learner, you can use novice word. This novice means that learner is at the initial stage or at the beginning of the course, or is the person who has just started to go through this journey, not the person who is quite confident or who is quite ahead. And if you say a person who is novice and you regard him or her as weak, then there are possibilities that learner would take it in a negative way or would feel discouraged. So be very cautious when it comes to using terminology and what learners have developed. Do not give them very tough tasks that are not relevant to them and also are ahead of them. So give the tasks which are suitable. It is quite good to give them the challenging task, but not at the cost of the possibility. So think of those criteria and parameter where they find ease and at the same time exciting and challenging as well. So like if you ask a question, let's say what are the steps that are involved in presentation skills. Instead you can ask them that you are going to present a topic on water scarcity. Mention the steps that you will involve while preparing for the presentation. This will be an applied method. It will help them to not just focus on the concepts, but it will make them close and they will feel associated with the question, and the personalized feeling would be created. So you should be particular when it comes to assessing them, and also the terminology, the language you put up in asking the questions and so on. Besides, you should communicate the learning goals and assessment criteria and check learner to know where you have reached far. And besides that, you should understand how the assessment criteria can be met by the use of examples. Incorporating examples would make the learning and teaching easy. Encourage peer assessment through effective use of assessment criteria, and more than that, you should think of self-assessment through effective use of the assessment criteria. Now this self-assessment will give them the opportunity to look their performances through the lens of different perspectives. They can analyze their performance through the lens of language delivery, confidence, clarity, pronunciation, content development, and so on. So self-assessment is quite helpful because they realize it, and when the realization take place, there is learning as well. So if you say the student that this is wrong or this is right, they may not take you positively or may not really realize it, but when they experience it and realize it, they will eventually learn it as well. So realization makes self-assessment a successful technique in assessment criteria. Let us look up at the conclusion now, and the first point says language assessment is a measure of the proficiency and language user has in any given language. Therefore, language assessment provides you a broader scope of understanding the learner's growth and development. However, there is a distinction between the language assessment and the language evaluation. So when it comes to evaluation, it is a systematic way of analyzing subjects' merit, worth, and significance using framework governed by a set of norms. So we go through the qualitative and the quantitative data analysis that would be under the evaluation criteria. Now coming on to the types of assessment that we studied. So we first looked on the diagnostic assessment, which is a form of pre-assessment or a kind of pre-test where teachers can evaluate the students' strong points, their weak points, and their knowledge and their skills before they start their class. So this gives them the whole idea what they are going to teach, what components should they include in their language teaching pedagogy, and what methods should they adopt in order to help the learners go through the curriculum. Besides, you studied formative and summative assessments, which are widely practiced components of classroom setting that report ongoing and final progress of the learner. So formative is something that we go through it eventually, like you can do it in the semester, then you can do it after the semester before you start the second semester, and then it can keep on continuing in the middle of the semester also. The formative assessment can work on, but this semester but this summative assessment happens at the end of there you measure the final outcome, and both play an important role when it comes to language learning. So teachers and students of English language deal with various assessment procedures in their lives on a daily basis. When students are sitting in their classrooms, you may not even tell them that they are getting assessed. It could be for observation purpose, and like I said, that formative assessment can be done in informal ways, or you can say continuous assessment can be done informally. What you can do is that you should not tell the students at some points where they do not require to get informed, and you can eventually measure the progress and modify what you are going to include in the next instruction accordingly. Now coming on to the next point, they organize and administer classroom assessment activities, use forms of continuous or formative assessment, and furthermore new developments in language teaching and learning require new competencies of teachers like maintaining portfolios, self-assessment, and peer assessment. As far as the portfolio and self-assessment and peer assessments are concerned, we will look up at these topics in detail in another session, but let me give you this idea that in language learning and teaching pedagogy, there are lots of varieties that are available. It's not that the traditional test that you give to the learner, you can conduct assessment in varying methods. For example, you can measure your students' progress through portfolio as well. Portfolio basically gives the detailed reflection of your learner's growth and development because it is eventually developed over time. Similarly, you can give them the opportunity of self-realization or self-assessment, and then they would find out their responses in light of the certain parameters, and they will get to know what are the components that they need to learn, where they stand, and how they can go ahead. So new developments take place when you include new competencies. And teachers need not to remain consigned to only these kind of assessment criteria or methods. They can eventually develop on their own depending upon the size and the level of the learners. That is something very important to understand. Tailor the classroom instruction in accordance with your students. You know the class size, you know the background of the learners, like you gathered these information in the needs analysis. You know the course outcomes and the goals, what you are seeking, what your learners are speaking, where you both the partners are inclining, and so on. So there is a wider scope for assessment. As far as the research purpose is concerned, there are variety of computer technology tools that are available in the market. They are assessing learners' skills in varying forms, and there is always a question on reliability and validity when it comes to looking up those tools. So there is a huge scope of researching over of computer assisted language learning assessments, and we will look the assessment forms in the next session in detail. And we have so far come to an end of this session, but I'm sure you have learned a lot. These are the references. See you in the next session. Thank you very much for joining.
Understanding oneself, understanding others, understanding society at large, understanding the nature, these are all driven by basic human curiosity. We would all love to understand why things happen, what happens, what is the final outcome, why certain things fail. These are all exercises that we perform in various domains of knowledge. Therefore, knowledge in various domains, you would realize they are actually social artifacts. They have to be rooted into historical perspective, they have to be culturally salient, and there would be socio-political reasons behind this. Whether you talk with respect to engineering sciences, whether you talk with respect to physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, that is the reason why humanities and social sciences should be understood by all of us. The knowledge that is segregated, that is divided with respect to areas, specializations, all of them needs to be understood in its context. And what provides the context? It is the social reality. How do you correlate knowledge in a given domain with the cultural reality, with the social reality, with the socio-political compulsions? Okay, how do you understand the law of nature, okay, in its totality? And for doing that, you require the understanding of humanities and social sciences. Say for instance, if you are trying to understand the effect of a particular bacteria, a virus, any microbe, how it affects behavior, how it affects the organism, human being, you start looking at it from a pure biological point of view. If you are trying to look at a particular type of a wavelength, say for example, you are emphasizing on the understanding of the effect of radiation on human life, you are looking at things from a physical point of view. You are looking at the corresponding changes inside the body, you are looking at the physiological side of the understanding of the information. You are trying to understand why, despite knowing the risk that is inbuilt in the process, why still human beings engage into it. You are looking at it from a pure behavioral point of view. Why society at large admire things which has full of risk. You are trying to understand things from a pure sociological point of view. why people use particular set of words to explain those experiences. You are trying to understand things from the linguistic point of view. So, there are whole lot of things, and then finally you try to combine all of them to say that what are the guiding principles in life. Then you say you are looking at life, you are looking at humanity from a pure philosophical point of view. And this is what social sciences courses provide you. They provide the context to you in which you would be finally positioning the understanding of the knowledge in any given domain. It could be engineering, it could be sciences, it could be medical sciences, it could be social sciences stuff, it could be humanities stuff. So, contextualizing the knowledge is what humanities social science courses help you obtain.